Hi viewers, in this video I will show you two ways on how to replace a left CV axle on a 2007 Volvo S40.
A while ago, I could feel a small vibration when the car was accelerating. I checked the CV axles and the left one had to be replaced. When I replaced it, I filmed two different procedures on how to free the outer CV shaft. First, the common procedure was to separate the ball joint from the knuckle. Then the optional procedure was to separate the strut from the knuckle. To begin, the car was safely jacked up and secured with two jack stands and four-wheel chucks. To have easy access to the inner CV joint, it is useful to remove the engine splash shield. Next, to ease the work, I sprayed some penetrating fluid on bolts and nuts. Not long after, I loosened the retaining bolt holding the CV shaft and the hub assembly together. I unscrewed the bolt about half an inch and I used a rubber mallet to loosen the shaft inside the hub assembly and make sure it was moving easily. When it's not moving easily, the retaining bolt should be removed. Then, a ball peen hammer and a brass punch should be used to retract the shaft. Most of the time, when I undo the swivel linkage nut with a wrench, I used a drive X bit socket to keep the ball stud stationary. Once the nut removed, the ball stud was still stuck in the bracket. I lifted the lower control arm to align the stud with the hole, then I removed the stud easily. After, I loosened the 21mm nut holding the ball joint. When there is too much rust on the stud, I use a smaller wire brush to clean the threads. The work was completed with a ratchet wrench. When it's very difficult to unscrew the nut because of corrosion, it is better to undo it completely while the ball joint is still stuck in the knuckle bracket. Not all ball joint separators are designed the same way, so I paid attention to make sure it would fit properly to avoid damaging the boot during the work. When the separator was compressing enough, the stud popped out. If needed, a lower control arm tool can be used to extract the ball joint. To remove the outer CV shaft completely from the hub assembly, I pulled the knuckle outwards. For safety, the CV axle can be held in place with a bungee cord. Instead of using a CV joint puller, most of the time I used a pickle fork separator to extract the inner CV shaft. A snap ring is used to lock the inner CV shaft in the differential. Even if the CV shaft is hard to remove, I don't hit too hard on my separator to avoid damaging the differential. I compared the CV axle I removed with the rebuilt one and they were the same model. To ease the fitting in the differential, I cleaned it and I applied a bit of bearing grease around the oil seal. I also applied a layer of grease on the splines and I inserted the inner CV shaft into the differential. I had to push hard to lock the snap ring in place. Normally, the outer CV shaft is easy to insert in the hub. To match the internal splines with the external splines, the hub might need to be rotated a little bit. Soon after, the ball joint was refitted and the nut was tightened. Because the ball joint nut is located in a tight space, I had to use a crowfoot wrench with a torque wrench for the final tightening. The torque was set to 52 foot-pounds. Next, I lifted the lower control arm to align and insert the sway bar link stud in the bracket. It is recommended to install a new nut on the stud. The torque was set to 37 foot-pounds. The ABS harness branch was also refitted. It is required by Volvo to replace the old retaining bolt with a new one. To properly tighten the CV axle bolt, first the torque was set to 26 foot-pounds. Then I completed the work by tightening the bolt an additional 90 degrees. When I performed the optional procedure to replace the CV axle, I also had to undo the CV axle bolt, the sway bar link stud, and the ABS harness branch. The rubber grommet securing the brake hose was detached for this procedure. Penetrating fluid was sprayed on the base of the strut and on the pinch bolt. The bolt was completely removed to pull out the strut from the clevis attachment. Tapping on the upper section of the knuckle with a ball peen hammer is a common procedure to separate the two parts. Personally, I like to use a jack to push down and disconnect the steering knuckle. When the strut was out of the clevis attachment, there was enough motion to remove the outer shaft from the hub assembly. To avoid damaging the brake hose during the replacement of the CV axle assembly, it's important to secure the knuckle in a safe position with a top strap or the equivalent. Like shown previously, the CV axle can be removed and replaced by a new one. A jack stand can also be used to support the steering knuckle until the outer shaft is inserted in the hub assembly. It is useful to clean the knuckle attachment and spread out the clevis bracket a little bit. In this view, looking upwards, I began by partially inserting the outer shaft in the hub assembly. Next, I properly positioned the lower section of the strut to insert the guiding hook in the clevis bracket. While keeping the steering knuckle in place, I used the jack to compress and refit the parts together. When the strut was fully inserted, I secured the parts together with the pinch bolt. The torque was set to 66 foot-pounds. Again, like shown before, the sway bar link and the ABS branch were reassembled. The grommet of the brake hose was also refitted. The CV axle bolt was tightened according to specs. The wheel and the splash shield were reinstalled.
At the end, I found it more convenient to separate the ball joint from the knuckle, but it's always good to know another way to do the work.